So, hello everyone. Very happy to see you this evening as we have a special guest together with us. This is Charlotte Danielsson. Straight away from the Silicon Valley, came to share her insights with our audience. Actually, she came for the Futurepreneurs project that's aiming to support new sustainability projects and entrepreneurs in the market. And tomorrow she will give an opening talk. But we use the chance to steal some of her time and to use a chance to give more insights about what's cooking in Silicon Valley. So as ROCKIT is partnering together with Women for Global Challenges project, and we invited many of you, particularly to meet with Charlotte and discuss what's the diversity in inclusion and what are the lessons learned from the Silicon Valley. So Charlotte is the CEO of
Silicon Vikings. Oh, that was loud.
Silicon Vikings, and as we've discussed, so what's the Vikings, why the Vikings? And she gave the explanation, what people know in the US about Nordics and Baltics. These are the Vikings, and that's the only thing you would learn from the books. So we told her, we'll prove you're wrong, and we have much more to show you. Lots of startup initiatives and entrepreneurship programs are running here. We're here more for the silicon part as we want to conquer the global goals. And I would like to invite you on a stage as I have a couple of questions for you.
Okay.
So welcome, Charlotte.
Thank you.
So Charlotte is full-time attorney, part-time CEO of Silicon Vikings. That's trying
Full-time both, actually.
Full-time both. And as we were discussing, so which way to go? As she was studying law, planning to be attorney, but still on one side, she's an entrepreneur and wanted to have her own business. And after kids are grown-ups, that's a time to go wild and do some great things. So she's also intensively traveling around the world, giving various talks, inspiring people. And thank you for being here. So that's your first time in Lithuania?
Yes, first time.
So
Beautiful
a part of the Vikings that I already mentioned, what were their expectations that you were thinking Lithuanians will be? As you're already working with Nordic and Baltic countries, so maybe you already met some Lithuanian startups, some grown-ups, some small enterprises. So what's your takeaway on startups and entrepreneurs from this region?
Definitely that there is a lot happening here. We cover, like you just mentioned, the Baltic region as well with Silicon Vikings. We are seeing more and more coming out of just the Baltic region, and it used to just be Sweden primarily. Way back, we started 20 years ago. It started Swedish, and then the other, Norway added, and Denmark, and Finland is more active now. The Baltic region has really, in the last few years, really been picking up a lot. We know there's tons of activity happening in this region here. We're not seeing as much yet of all of you guys coming over to Silicon Valley, which I think is the next step, and we'd love to see more of that happening.
As your company aims to build bridges between Silicon Valley and the Nordics, so we have this question, so does the bridge work both ways? Are people from the Silicon Valley actually interested in our region, or is just us desperately trying to get on the other side?
It used to be us here desperately trying to get to the other side only, and people had no clue really even what the Nordics were, and I would say, oh, I'm from Sweden, I was born in Sweden, and they say, oh yeah, I've been to Switzerland, I loved it there. That's always what happened. But the Nordic brand in Silicon Valley has become very big. A lot of startups who have kind of come out of that region that have had a lot of impact. So within, and that's mainly what we're doing on that end, is really branding the Nordic brand in Silicon Valley, and that's been working really well. So you have most VCs know what the Nordic region is about, and they know, oh, there's a lot of innovation coming out of this area. We are finally, and that's just really in the last year and a half, starting to see interest from the US and actually coming this way. We've seen finally some venture capital funds actually traveling in this direction to sort of meet with companies, and that's a first. And we also see them sort of, especially in certain areas, fintech is one, and digital health is another in particular, where they're looking to the Nordic region as kind of, hey, you all have more happening there than in the US. And so we're definitely finally seeing the bridge going from the US into this direction.
So for you as a female leader, how do you combine family life, 2 kids, already grown-ups, but still I believe you kept doing those 2 full-time works at the same time. Like what's the balance? How do you manage to do everything at the same time?
I think it's really just being fully present in whatever you're doing at the moment that you're doing it is kind of the key, and not exactly multitasking at any given moment. You're actually more productive if you focus on one thing at a time. And there isn't, I think the key is too, as women especially, we have this idea that it's supposed to be perfectly balanced all the way through, which is completely impossible. And it's really just whatever is the priority at that given moment, you focus on that completely, and then you move to the next thing and the next thing. So it's really just very targeted concentration in different time periods.
Okay, so not to keep you too much longer, I have the last question. So today we talk about diversity and inclusion, especially in the Silicon Valley, but what's your takeaway about this topic in tech area in general? Is it something still that needs a lot of improvement, or we're going in the right direction? Is everything balanced? Of course not, but let's see what the numbers bring up to us, right? So what do you think, why it's important to talk about diversity issues that are currently in the market?
It's important to talk about because we're not even close to where we should be, and that's across the board in all countries. But yeah, especially in Silicon Valley, where it sort of has always kind of been the model, since it's where this whole thing kind of started. We haven't gotten it right in Silicon Valley, and I think looking at, and that's what this is about, kind of is looking at what can we learn from where we've failed there, so we can kind of lower the learning curve in other spots. And that's kind of my objective here, is maybe you all can skip a few steps of some of the stupid things we've done there, and sort of advance ahead of time. I think the more we talk about it, the more aware we are, and the more we can kind of do things about it, instead of, there's an assumption a lot of times that, oh, it's me personally is the issue, and I think women especially internalize that. And understanding that some of what you're getting isn't at all about you, it's really a systemic thing, helps to move us forward.
Great. So let's listen your presentation, and then for the rest of the audience, we will have question session at the end. So make sure you have at least a couple of questions prepared. And Charlotte, stage is yours. Thank you once again for coming.
Thank you. And sorry, you'll see me drinking a lot of water. The climate change always just dries out my mouth. But I thank you all so much for having me here. As she mentioned, her CEO, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about what Silicon Vikings is. It's a 45,000 plus network that connects Nordic and Baltic innovation with Silicon Valley and vice versa. We have been headquartered in Silicon Valley for 22 years now. So we have really deep roots in the area, and I like to say we kind of go beyond the Nordic bubble that exists there. You have a lot of government entities and things working in the area, which is basically a lot of the same advice you would get here, sort of told to you by the people who have just been there a year or two. And one of the things that we have through our boards and other people is really just a deep network there that helps you connect right with the people that you're really trying to reach, both in terms of customers, venture capital, and so forth. Like she mentioned there, 2 full-time jobs, sort of. Silicon Vikings is my way of giving back. My actual pay the bills job is that I've been an attorney for 22 years almost now, helping foreign companies establish themselves in the US and helping with the visa issues as well. and helping U.S. companies secure foreign labor that they need to move forward. Law degree is from Stanford, bachelor's degree is from Berkeley, and that's my contact information if you'd like to connect. Wanted to look at, this is sort of the outline of what we're going to go through today, and I'm actually, by the way, also happy to take questions as we go through if you don't want to wait till the end. I always tell my kids that I'm going to interrupt you in the middle of when you're talking because I'm not going to remember what I was going to say when you finish your story. So you're free to do that because I understand. So first I want to talk about how Silicon Valley has really benefited from diversity and inclusion and where Silicon Valley has failed. And with the goal of sort of going through what proactive steps that you can take based on the successes and failures to sort of move the region forward here. So starting off with how we've benefited, one of the biggest things that makes Silicon Valley special is that we have a very high influx of people from all over the globe. And that global diversity is something that has been a huge benefit for Silicon Valley. As this article mentions, more than half of the big tech companies that you know of were founded by immigrants or children of immigrants. And that accounts for nearly $4 trillion, and that's an old statistic. That was the most recent one from 2018, so it's even higher than that. And what we know through, and you've probably heard this research, but if no one has, there's been a lot of research done that really proves that there is a link between diversity and innovation. That companies that have policies, here is one finding, that encourage retention and promotion of workers across race, sexual orientation, and the gender spectrum are more innovative and release more products. Logically, if you think about it, it makes sense, right? Originally, if you had 4 white men from the same geographical area coming up with a problem or solution to a problem, they're all going to come from the same mindset and come up with the same, more or less, idea. You add in a woman, she's looking at it from a different perspective, and suddenly you'll say, hey, wait, but we haven't thought about this. The more diversity you have in the room, the more viewpoints you have, so the more innovative and out-of-the-box that thinking becomes. So it's always a benefit. There's also, though, been, because there's always this attitude that, with women, for example, well, we have to let more women in because it's the right thing to do, kind of thing is the mentality of where it comes from. Not that it's actually good for business. And there's been research that has shown that you actually really increase your revenue. It's actually beneficial to the company outcomes. So where have we failed? Now this part's a little bit longer, so and more interesting, and some of it you've heard. But glass ceiling definitely exists there in an extreme. I put down here and this is US-wide, so not specific to Silicon Valley, but you see that so far, you all are actually outdoing us on this gender gap rankings, both overall and in the subcategory of economic participation and opportunity. I put a side-by-side view here to say that there are some areas, the only one actually is educational attainment, where we're actually ranked above where Lithuania is. Political empowerment, though, you see the US is ridiculously low. Health and survival, again, ridiculously low. In terms of startups in particular, this study shows that half of the startups have no women on their leadership teams. And this shows a couple different areas, but you see the US is lagging in a lot. Now, the darker one is board of directors. The lighter blue is executive positions. When we're talking, though, when we see this percentage, 37%, we're not talking about a board full of women. We're talking about one woman on a board that could be, 12 men. So when you look at that, too, in terms of this statistic, it's especially dismal. So with startups, one of the things, as you know, as you're trying to build your startups, is that there's less structure, there's less sort of HR types of things in place. And what that means is that typically startups don't really have anything in their policies to sort of promote gender diversity. So the statistics are actually even worse in startups than in big companies, other than the facts that flexible work environments tend to really benefit women in that. But you'll see there's actually nothing where they're really trying, or very few, goal to add female board members. Only 17% had that as a goal. Leadership development, unconscious bias in training, training and promotions training, 19%. So that, as startups, is actually something that when you're thinking of starting your company can make a really big difference when you're structuring the company, is to actually have those policies and things on your mind. Otherwise, you're going to kind of naturally fall into the flow of what's happening in the community. So being more proactive there is definitely something that can make a difference. Also wanted to point out, so we're not just focused on women, is that race is a huge issue in the US as well. Most of the tech industry in the US really wouldn't be there without, as I mentioned, it's a global economy. 50% of tech workers in Silicon Valley are Asian. Most of that is immigration from India, some from China, but you see the statistic is really high. And what we've ended up doing in Silicon Valley is we bring in all these workers, but we only let them at most 30% get to like mid-level management. You see the statistic is really low, 8% are board members, 12% top executives. So we've kind of created a subclass of tech workers, even though, and this is completely, for the most part, the people we're talking about have degrees that are higher than the other people who are sort of their managers and so forth. So this is really something to watch for when you have immigration coming in, is to make sure that this doesn't happen. When you add then an extra category there where you're battling, you're a woman and you're a minority race, you see Asian American women, 0.3% total number of officers in large corporations. So that's sort of a extra element there. LGBTQ diversity, again, is also very low in an area, especially when you think about tech startups as sort of being the area where innovation, and we're supposed to be leading in different areas. 29 out of our 50 states offer no protection for sexual orientation or gender identity. That's ridiculous. There's no federal protection. Basically, in 29 states, you can just be fired for saying, I'm gay. So then the next statistic there, 46% of LGBT workers are closeted in the workplace, actually makes a lot of sense because it isn't safe to come out. Openly gay LGBT corporate leaders are very rare. You have fewer than 20 board directors in Fortune 500 companies. So when we talk about diversity, we really aren't, and the value of diversity, we aren't just talking about men and women. We're talking about all sort of different types of diversity, because the more different levels of diversity you have, the better your innovation output is. Sexual harassment, you all must have gotten a lot of news on this stuff. Me Too, I'm sure, hit here as well. You've seen Uber's CEO having to step down. You've seen big venture capitalists have to kind of leave their stations. Positive thing is it finally got to the forefront and people started talking about it. Here's a survey that was done of people in tech. Here you see 60% of women in tech reported unwanted sexual advances. And 1 in 3 felt afraid for their personal safety because of work-related circumstances. That's a really high number. And something that sort of has just been accepted for a long time as just being, well, that's the way that it is. When they do report it, 60% say not really satisfied with the outcome most of the time. It's been sort of just, oh, yeah, well, this is his first offense, and we'll maybe write something. We told him not to do that again, and that's sort of the end of that. Motherhood penalty. This is one that's actually a huge thing in the area in general in Silicon Valley, but not just in tech, but in all sort of service industries. And that is, it really affects your your career path. You're not seen as professional as if you didn't have children. Now it has actually been something that you start off, there's sort of an age gap for that, or you're allowed to, once you're fully established in your career, you can kind of safely have kids, but that means you're, 40 or so before you get to do it. If you're doing it as a young woman, it's something that very much throws you off of any career path and trajectory. So for me, this is one area in particular where I think feminism is very much behind and something that really needs to be addressed. You see here, impact of family. 75% were asked about family life, marital status, and children in interviews. That's women asked that. It's, by the way, illegal to be asked that in an interview. So the fact that 75% still say, yeah, they asked me that, is a pretty incredible statistic. Men don't get asked if you have kids at home, if you're married, it has no relevance for the employer, but it still does with women. We barely have maternity leave in the US as it is, and most of that is unpaid leave if you do it. And despite that, the little leave we are allowed, those who took maternity leave, 52% shortened their leave because they thought it would negatively impact their career. So we're not even really able to take the full amount that we're legally supposed to be allowed to take, because we know that it's like you have this stress when you're at home with your newborn that, oh, I'm gonna not get to keep my job when I get back. Technically they have to keep you, right? You come back, but then you've lost esteem with your colleagues, you're not as serious, it definitely has an impact. Immigration backlash. Now this is despite the fact that a lot of the primary sort of impetus here for what's happened in the development with Silicon Valley and tech has been immigration-based. You saw the statistic there, over 50% of the big tech companies started by immigrants. Despite that, we have a ton of pushback because there's this, oh, they're taking our jobs philosophy, which statistically is not true. So you see restrictions on H-1B visa is the primary visa that tech professionals use in order to be able to come into the US. Tons of pushback on that and restrictions added. Fees go up every year. They put a cap on the number. It keeps happening. One of the impacts of this, though, is that net migration in the Bay Area, which means there are more people leaving than coming into the Bay Area, which is Silicon Valley. When I say Bay Area, if you didn't know that, has actually turned negative. So more people are leaving than coming in, and that's a very negative sign. Long-term impact for Silicon Valley is not good, which also means that other regions have a chance to sort of really pop up and take advantage of some of that happening now. Unconscious bias is one of the biggest obstacles for women. Even when there isn't sort of outright discrimination, there's a lot of still perceptions or stereotypes out there. 88% of women have experienced clients or colleagues addressing questions to male peers that should have been directed at them. So for example, if you're the one running the department and you're having a meeting and you have your intern, male intern with you, they're gonna turn and they're gonna ask the male intern the question. That's just kind of how it has always been there. There's an assumption that the man is in charge. Again, demeaning comments is pretty normal there. Asked to do lower level tasks than what a male colleague does. Very common at 49% reporting that. Bigger obstacle we've seen more recently and what you've seen in some of the news things and why some of the people have had to step down is this idea of there's no seat at the table. A lot of the networking that happens is social in nature, and they've been sort of little boys clubs happening throughout the region and places where women really don't feel like they're comfortable. 66% felt excluded from key social networking opportunities because of gender. 59% have felt they haven't had the same opportunities as their male counterparts. 90% witnessed sexist behavior at company offsites and or industry conferences. That's because the second that anyone's away from the actual work location, they kind of feel like, oh, okay, don't have to be as careful. So it's kind of conference or company event, the behavior gets worse. Women, of course, it's the normal, we're trying to find the balance between gotta be assertive, but can't be too assertive because then I'm considered bitchy. What's the sort of right line there? That's something that men don't have to deal with, this whole sort of perception of what you're supposed to act like in things. And you see that 84% have been told that they're too aggressive. Venture capital industry in particular, wanted to point out this statistic because still pretty appalling and not getting any better. 94% of investing partners are male. That's a lot. That means 6% are women. That is one of the worst industry statistics we've seen with the difference in gender equality, and that's something that hasn't gotten better. Female entrepreneurs, less than 2% of venture capital dollars go to startups founded by women. And that's despite the fact that 38% of the business in the US are female-led. So I don't know, we can explore the idea too of maybe the number of partners in venture capital firms being women and the amount of funding is actually related. There are definitely things that show that it is. The idea, though, maybe these statistics will get better. Wanted to comment in general here on what we're seeing with gender gap in STEM education. No signs of this improving. The US has a very strong, you see it's actually, without completely going through the scores, we're doing horribly in terms of making sure that little girls get STEM education and grow up to be women who work in STEM. You see, you guys here, the green, it's neutral, doing a good job. The US is very much lagging there. This is a quote from Abraham Lincoln that I love. The best way to predict the future is to create it. And that's kind of the mentality or mindset I'd love for you all to go into with this as we go into the section about talking about what proactive steps that you can take based on what we've seen go wrong in Silicon Valley and what's gone right. First, this last year, in 2019, there was finally a law passed, just in California though, so the other states are still in trouble. But California said for public companies that have corporate headquarters in California, you're required to have women on the board. That's going to help the statistics go up. A lot of companies have been very upset about this, and how are we going to find women to do that, which is ridiculous. You see that by 2019, last year, they had to have one woman. There's a rolling scale up to 2021 where they have some time there to find who they need based on the number of board members, that they have to add the number of women there corresponding to the size of the board, just to kind of get things moving, which is great. There was also a new law passed, I think it was last year as well, where there's a big gap in pay between men and women for the same positions. So one of the things the California governor did was get this legislation onto the books where an employer is no longer allowed to ask you what your prior salary was from your employer, which is actually ingenious and a great way to get rid of the gender gap in pay. It's really your position is worth whatever it is you say you're going to pay. The position is worth being paid. That's what you have to pay. You no longer get to say, oh, okay, well, you were making 50 at your last job, we'll give you 55 or whatever, when your male counterpart has sort of been making more all along. Because the problem is, if you're basing it off of what your prior pay was, and the pay disparity starts early on in the careers, you end up sort of perpetuating that. So that's a really big move in the right direction. In terms of, I wanted to talk a little bit about what some of these sort of bigger biases and things have and how they affect personal barriers, and this idea that we have to look at ourselves as well. This is not, to clarify, we actually have a number of accelerator programs in Silicon Valley that basically teach women, this is how you need to act and be, and sort of these are the male characteristics you have to take on. That's not at all what I'm saying, and I hate those programs. I don't think they're right. I think you need to be who you are, and this is not that kind of conversation. But gender discrimination in general is a systemic problem. So we all have things in our head that we don't even really know is there and why we're thinking about it. So what I'm suggesting in this section is really just evaluating in yourself, like, oh, maybe I think that because of this way I've been treated forever, and maybe my outcome would be different. This is one here. Whether you think you can or you think you can't, you're right. Love that quote, because it's true. If you think you can't, you're not going to do it, and it's not happening. One of the things that women in particular are very much affected by, and startups too in general, but is imposter syndrome. Startups, there's been a lot of research on this. It's that feeling that everybody else has a real company, but mine's not really real. And someone's gonna find out that I'm just kind of faking it and I'm not really an entrepreneur. And it goes across industries. I mean, 22 years into law practice, I'm still sometimes like, oh my goodness, they're gonna realize I don't know anything. I mean, and of course we do, and there's no difference. And startups as a whole, because it's not a big company that's sort of had this stamp of approval sort of from the whole world, you have that feeling with any kind of startup industry. Women, though, have this anyway on top of what they're doing. So it's a real thing, and if you have never heard of it, look it up and read about it and understand that sometimes some of your insecurities are this. And if you knew that, then you'd be like, oh wait, this is imposter syndrome. This isn't really real how I'm feeling right now. It's not because I'm inferior, I don't know this, or I'm not as good as the other people in the thing. It's really just, this is a syndrome thing that happens. The other thing is, I would like to say for all of you to embrace what's called just-in-time learning. And I'll go through that in a second. Sheryl Sandberg said, women need to shift from thinking, I'm not ready to do that, to, I want to do that, and I'll learn by doing it. One of the things we've seen as sort of an outcome from gender bias overall, and unconscious bias in particular, in hiring situations, for example, it's statistically shown that women get promoted and hired based on proven track records. So if you're going to be hired as a manager for something, you have to have a ton of management experience, you have to show that you've done all these valuable things. Men, on the other hand, get hired based on your potential and your ability. That's something that never happens with women. Okay, we always have to show that we're great at this. And we have that in our heads too. I can't do this because I've never done it before. And that's because societally we've been taught that. And so, especially running a startup, you're not going to know everything from day one. There's this huge learning curve and process that's going to happen all the way through. And you're always going to be constantly kind of learning and trying to sort of catch up. And you just have to know that everybody's doing that. It's not just you. Again, when you take those things into account, if you have, and this again is not talking about stand the way that a man would and all of that. It's actually saying, if you look at yourself and you realize maybe I shy away a little bit because I feel like I'm not as good, look at the things that you do. Like, are you afraid to raise your hand because you're gonna feel stupid because you don't know everything about that topic yet? Then maybe reassess that and sort of figure out what things affect the way you present yourself based on those things. That wasn't too controversial, but setting yourself up for success despite external conscious bias. Now this is where we're talking about actual things, not anything within you, but things coming at you from different directions. Venture capital is one where we see a lot of this external unconscious bias hitting female entrepreneurs. Like I said, this statistic again, less than 2% of venture dollars go to female-founded companies. So This is interesting because Q&A interactions between 140 prominent venture capitalists and 189 entrepreneurs, 12% female, at TechCrunch Disrupt New York, was analyzed. And it was done through AI and other things as well, and everybody looked at them. And they found that male startups raised 5 times more funding than the female-led ones. Are the female startups just not as good? No, that wasn't the answer. They looked through the actual questions that venture capitalists asked female entrepreneurs versus what they asked male entrepreneurs. Male founders were asked about potential for gains, what they labeled as promotion questions. Women were asked about potential losses and what they called sort of prevention questions. And evidence of this bias, this part was the most interesting, evidence of that bias, of the types of questions asked, were the same, whether it was a female venture capitalist or a male venture capitalist asking it. So while having more female venture capitalists is important, this shows that that's not really the only, that won't solve the problem completely. So what do we mean by this? This was a chart that they did. So when you're talking about promotion versus questions, so one of the things as a startup, right, is that you have to go in there and you have to prove to the venture capital people that, oh, my startup is going to do so well. It's going to, change the industry and disrupt everything. You're going to make them tons of money. You're not going in there just to show, I'm not going to lose your money. So if your questions are asked so that all you're doing is saying, look, your investment's safe enough, I'm going to keep it safe, and that's it, you're not going to get funding or you're not going to get very much. Versus if you show sort of the potential growth, you would. So if you take an example here, a promotion question, so the question to a male entrepreneur, how do you want to acquire customers? Versus to the female, how many daily and monthly active users do you have? Income questions. To the man, how do you plan to monetize this? Versus to the woman, how long will it take to break even? You're basically answering, and you can sort of read through a bunch of them, but you're answering sort of, one is an optimistic response and the other is kind of a defensive response. So you're going to end up not overall giving the impression that your company is doing really well. That's what we said with that one. So this one here, when you say entrepreneurs were asked prevention questions but gave mostly promotion responses, went on to raise an average of $7.9 million in funding. So when a woman is asked a prevention question and they flip it and they answer it as a promotion question, 7.9 million was the average that they got. Entrepreneurs who were asked prevention questions and they answered the prevention question, an average of 563,000. That's a huge difference just based on how you respond to a question. And most people, your inclination would be, if you didn't know that this was a real thing, your inclination would be to just answer the question that you're asked, right? But if you know that this bias exists, you can turn it around and you can flip the question like some of the women knew to do and end up with a whole lot more money, which is the goal. So let's look at this one, promotion question here. I just had some examples. So how do you think you're going to get at this market versus the prevention one? How do you plan to defend your market share given how competitive the landscape is? So this is an example of how to switch it if you got the prevention question to answer. We're playing in such a large and fast-growing market that it's bound to attract new entrants. We hope to gain increasing share in this attractive market by leveraging our startup's unique assets. So they're not really answering the question, they're moving it and they're flipping it. What is your customer retention strategy was the prevention question. They switched it to a promotion answer. We're improving our daily and monthly active user numbers each period for a net growth rate of X%. We plan to accelerate this rate by promoting the following customer growth strategy. How long will it take you to break even? Instead of actually answering that, the promotion answer is something like, we're actually managing the business for aggressive top-line growth and a good deal of sales momentum so far. Here's what our sales forecast looks like. Our goal is to expand our margins as we grow our top line throughout this forecast period. Another way here to handle or deal with external unconscious bias is through what I'd call professional branding. So we all know the different stereotypes, right? Women aren't good leaders the way men are and that type of thing. We have all these tools at our disposal where we can help with some of that. Social media available for free and everybody can use it, for example. Why not start to do that? Flip some of the stereotypes just based on who you are. I'm not saying to sort of change who you are, but show more of what you do in a way that shows that you have leadership potential, for example. So if you're trying to establish that, you want to show you're an expert. Well, establish your professional expertise on social media and other ways and sort of build your professional branding. And if you put that into we spend all our time thinking about how do I build my startup. Well, as a woman, that's not all you have to do. You really should be, or to excel as quickly as possible, is to build your brand at the same time. And if you do that, you'll have an easier time because they'll kind of pick up on those things. Speaking at events, showing yourself in leadership roles, doing sort of social things in sort of higher circles, great. Risk-taking is one thing that is sort of necessary for startups. Do you have hobbies and things that kind of show that in a momentum as you build your network and people see you doing that? Why not post some of those things? Strategic networking is something also that I think that we aren't taught to the extent that we should be, and that's one of the barriers, I think, especially for women, that exists there, but this is something that men can definitely learn to do too. One of the biggest barriers in general for women and minorities in other ways is that they don't have the same level of built-up networks that male counterparts do. And so you have to actually go about doing that in a strategic way in order to be effective. And why I say strategic too is not just to make it effective, but you only have a certain amount of time in a given day. And so the best way to do it is to really plot it out and plan it out like you would with your business. So this is one that sort of shows even in the importance of networking. 80% of jobs are landed through networking, not through a regular application process. And this one, 100 general applications, only 1 in 100 general applications winds up getting the position. 1 in 7 who's been referred in gets the position. So it has a huge impact, and missing networks are sort of part of the reason a lot of people don't move forward. Now, when I talk about strategic networking, I also want to talk about and formulate this around Silicon Valley style networking, which is one of the things I think I get asked most about, and because we do a ton of events with Nordic people coming over, and it seems to be the most kind of misunderstood thing. How do you network in Silicon Valley? And I swear it works everywhere in the world, and it really is just more strategic networking. And what this pay it forward concept is the most misunderstood. I get a lot of people who I've never met before, either on social media or anything else, where they just say, hey, can you introduce me to Apple? No, I don't even know who you are. I don't understand. What? Because everyone's heard that, oh, you can meet anyone in Silicon Valley. And that's true, you can, but you have to remember that most of the time, it's the person introducing you to the person you want to talk to. It's their network that they've built up for years. It's sort of a referral, and it's not that everyone is willing to meet with everyone, it's that somebody else has built up a network, and you have to really understand and respect that. And one of the best ways to very quickly kind of move up in the scale and to get people to refer you and other things is to show yourself as valuable in some way. And that doesn't mean directly. Like the first thing people do will look you up on LinkedIn and see who are you connected to, how many people are you connected to, who do we know in common, what have you done, that kind of thing, to see Okay, because the person that's referring you is taking a risk by referring you in, because if they make a referral and you come late, you're not prepared, whatever the situation is, it reflects badly on the person that referred you, and the other person is less likely to sort of take referrals from them. So you want to kind of remember that as you're doing it. And this mentality of pay it forward really is about being beneficial. So when you're starting to think of how will I build my strategic network, start off by thinking, how can I make myself valuable to the network in a way that makes me someone who can pay it forward? Because once you do that, you're going to get the benefit of sort of being other people paying it forward for you, because that's just kind of how it works. The more respect you have in a network, and the sort of higher level contacts you are, the easier it is to meet anybody. So don't think of it as a one-on-one kind of transaction here. So first of all, it's a long-term thing. The biggest thing I see is, well, I went to an event, I didn't meet anybody. It doesn't work all the time. And that's not how it happens, and that's not how you build a networking. Oh, it's just a waste of time. I don't have time to do it because I have to build my business. I don't have time for this stuff. It doesn't produce anything. Not true. It has to be a long-term thing that you think through and do. You also have to think broadly and network up is what I like to say. So what that means is that instead of thinking, okay, it's not a sales endeavor. You're not going to a networking event to sell your product. You're going to a networking event, or you're reaching out to people to actually make a connection for future purposes. It doesn't have to be a customer. It doesn't have to be somebody who has something directly that you need, and it really shouldn't be most of the time. It needs to be that you seek out and make connections with people who are important in the ecosystem. So, and with them, you're not asking them for anything. You're introducing yourself, you're saying hello, you're buying them coffee, whatever it is. And you do more and more and more of that, and then suddenly you have a much broader network that will be there and you'll be able to utilize at one point, but it is something that takes time to build up. One of the easiest ways to do that is to sort of go through the organizations in your area, and look through sort of, does this group have the kind of people that I need for either to connect me to other people or who are already in the industry I'm trying to go into? And you identify a couple of them, and then you actually do what I'd call sort of a deep dive into those organizations, and you make yourself a valuable part of that. You really, you volunteer, you become a chair for something, and then all of a sudden, those people will help sort of make your connection. Instead of going to 50 different events where you don't know anyone, you pick up random business cards, really get in with the people of the ecosystem there, just a few organizations that you think you can really get into and impact. Professional groups is something that we are finally really learning in Silicon Valley, and it took a long time for women in particular. There are now this idea that you need the network to get up. One of the easiest ways to do that is for women to connect with other women in the industry where they need to be. So we've seen more and more of this growing, and that's something that when someone opens a group in specific industries, they're huge successes and they keep going. So there's definitely a need to connect. I don't know how much time we have, if that's... Are we close to it now? Good? Okay. Okay. Making connections you need for effective networking. So this is one I get asked a lot, since we do a lot of these things in Silicon Valley, is I kind of wrote down my key things of how to make the most out of an event that you go to, because I see people doing this wrong all the time. So I think it helps to do this. First of all, networking at an event, it's not a popularity contest. Most people go in there and they think of it more as a social thing, like, oh, I need to meet a ton of people. No, you need to meet who you need to meet. It's really about being effective. It's not about the most things. So one of the things I like to say first is arrive early. You have an easier chance if you arrive early. It's intimidating for a lot of people, especially if you're an introvert, to walk into a room full of people that you don't know, and how do you make a contact? How do you connect? If you come early, you're more likely first to meet the organizers, which are the people that will mostly benefit you later. They're the most advantageous for you because they know other people in the ecosystem. You have an easier time. You've sort of already made your entrance. You also have a chance to, when there are name tags, to look through who's going to be here. Now, again, you don't want to spend, with networking, there's maybe half an hour before an event or after an event that you get to. You don't want to waste that time talking to someone who's completely irrelevant in some way. For you, look through the name tags before everybody comes and takes them and see, okay, oh, this person from whatever company is here. I got to make sure I meet that one. Even if you don't talk to anyone else the rest of the night, you've made a connection that you need. And like I said, the event organizers. The other thing I see people do all the time is they come in, they're like, oh, thank goodness I got someone to talk to. And they stick to that person because they're kind of afraid. It's like a security thing, and people are uncomfortable networking. Everyone is uncomfortable networking. You shouldn't be doing that. You should be working the room as much as you can. Because it's not about, I made a friend. It's, I need to sort of work my way through and see who I can meet that'll be beneficial moving on. So, other mistake is, first time you meet someone, you're like, hi, this is what I do, here's my card. They're not going to remember you. They just take their card and they'll move on, and that card is in the trash can that same evening. That's not going to do anything for you. What you want to do is make a personal connection with whoever you're talking to. Don't sell them anything. Don't sell them your company. If they ask you what you do, you kind of tell them, and that's it. But if they don't bring it up, don't bring it up. Easiest thing to do is have them talk about themselves. Ask open-ended questions. You basically want to make them, you want them to remember you by them feeling good about the conversation. They're not going to remember what you said. They're going to remember, oh, I liked that guy, right? And then you have an ability to follow up. Hey, I talked to you the other night, just wanted to say, can we go for coffee? And they'll say yes. If you were the pushy sales guy who came up and said, buy my product, they're going to say, oh, I'm busy. Sorry, can't make it for coffee. And the best thing you can do, and this, like I said, the easiest way is to get into an organization in some way where you're volunteering and sort of you know everybody in some way in that organization, you've sort of done the deep dive, is to get to the point where you know enough people in the room that you introduce people that you're talking to other people. Because that puts you in a position suddenly where you're important and you look like a connector, and you're doing that pay it forward thing without any effort. So you're like, oh, hey, Christine, oh, yeah, oh, you do that? Oh, there's this other guy over here, he works in this industry, let me introduce you. And then both of those people are suddenly like, wow, this woman's important. She just introduced me around. And that's one of the best things that you can do. After each event, don't leave the cards at the bottom of your briefcase or purse. Take them out, throw out the ones that are completely irrelevant for you. And then the next one, and by irrelevant, I don't mean not in your industry. I mean it's someone who's unemployed and looking for work or something and has nothing to do with what you're doing or has any sort of potential for anything. The rest of them, go through them and prioritize, okay, this is my plan for this person, this is my plan for this one, this is how I'll do that, and sort of categorize, oh, if you meet someone who's really important, even if you don't know how you're going to be able to sort of complete that connection, ultimately, you want to make sure you at least connect on LinkedIn and you kind of have that level of relationship going. Plus, if you're doing the other stuff with the professional branding, this person is suddenly seeing everything you do and how experienced and smart you are. So you're made the connection enough to link with them that way. And a last, final leaving thought here is there's no limit to what we as women can accomplish, is what Michelle Obama said. And I want you to remember that as you move forward. And I'm happy to take any questions if you have any. That was it. Yes?
Thank you for presentation. I probably have a few questions. And first thing, you've mentioned at the beginning of the presentation is the great benefits of diversity. And you mentioned that there is most of the time no diversity in the, for example, startup management boards and so on. And just idea and observation and question. So most of the time, startups are founded by people who have similar views, most likely are friends, and so on and so on. And that's how we get a not very diverse co-founder team. So how do we benefit from diversity here, and how do we go around this problem?
Well, for example, if you're starting off with a product and you're an engineer, you're going to talk to your engineer buddy first because that's who you know, right? And so you guys are going to come up with this great idea. You're not going to go very far if you stay in that sphere of what you're doing. So the next thing you need is someone with a business background who can really sort of see that side of it and how to market the company and all of that. The more diverse, if you intentionally at that point, you're looking at, okay, I need people who have different experience than me that can bring the company forward, that's going to benefit your company, because otherwise you're all just telling each other it's a great idea. And it might be, but it might not be. And even if you think it's a great idea, you're not going to have the sales skills or the marketing skills and so forth to bring it forward. When you're doing that process, though, if you add in the idea of, okay, let's make this a really diverse person, let's make sure it's a woman or a racial minority, something, and you build that team as broadly as you can, you're going to be able to see everything from more angles and accelerate more quickly. Make sense?
Yeah, thank you. And another question, just also maybe an observation about that requirement regarding male and female ratio in management boards. And do you believe that it's a good idea to enforce it that way, or it's not the best thing to do?
It's something that we've seen. I think it's a good idea. That it's not really even a ratio so much as a minimum requirement. The issue is that board members basically recruit people that they know, right? And if it's what we have in the U.S. is the problem of it's all old white men in every board. I mean, their diversity doesn't even go to let's get a young guy in there. It's actually just old gray-haired men running everything. And they say, hey, Jim from the golf club, he'd be good on our board. And then that's how they kind of add more people. So there's no way that that will naturally fix itself. And it has been shown that all of these companies would do better if they had more people in there. So at this point, yeah, it absolutely is necessary because there's no way up. Otherwise, there's no way to get that in there.
And yeah, I'll try to play a role of devil's advocate maybe here. So doesn't it create a risk, for example, for some like more skilled people not to get into position just because they are male and they already have enough males on their team? Doesn't that create some sort of...
No, because there are enough, I mean, in this day and age, there are enough skilled women, and it's always looked at in a biased way anyway, the way that they're evaluating things. And that was one of the biggest arguments, I mean, in the field of law, for example, one of the partners, when it was like, oh, we need to get women, well, how are we going to find a qualified woman? Well, they're everywhere. They might not be in that immediate circle because they're not in the boys' country club that you're looking at, but they exist. So it makes them actually have to look out and around. And so it's kind of one of those things where there's an assumption in that question that there aren't qualified women, and there are, but they're not necessarily in the right network of where the people are looking. So they need to broaden their networks, and that's what it requires.
Follow-up question. So for example, if you ask during the interview someone if she is going to have children, like and that's some sort of discrimination. You agree with that? So if we have that ratio on our team of we already have enough males, and then we say, hey, yeah, you're great, but you know what? We already have enough males, and we can't take you because you're not a female. So doesn't that discrimination thing work other way around?
I'm not sure.
Discriminating someone because he's a male.
No. No, because if you're looking overall at equity, and the goal here is we have to move forward as a society in some way. If the woman if you're talking about two candidates and the male candidate is better than the woman and it objectively is that case, broaden your network and find one who's better. The idea that you can't find a woman who's more competent than that man is not true.
Okay, thank you.
You just might not know the person yet.
Maybe I'll just add another idea that male and female, they have different kind of mindsets. So if we look at the founders, usually the founders are, like the male founders are very straightforward, they're taking risks, but the females are the ones that calculate the risk and see what's behind the action. And maybe to answer your question, that would be, you need to evaluate what exact skills do you need, not do you need male or female. So what kind of personality would be more as an added value for you? So this is not a saying that, if you're planning to hire only the female right now, as you're already 4 guys in the front row. But, think of the skill set that you need. And the question would be, how are you building your team diversity at Silicon Vikings, and how has been it so far?
Well, we try and get a combination of, obviously, as the female leader, that's a big thing right now. A lot of our board, actually all of it when I started, was all old white men. Have added in a lot more women into that mix and added a lot more age differences as well into it. So I've been actively doing it. It's a process that takes a while. And that isn't even from outright discrimination. That's not even really what we're talking about in most organizations. We're talking about sort of the unconscious bias that's underneath that. But it is something that you can't instantly just like turn over the whole board. But you do, as you're doing it, you're making the choices and decisions, you have to be really conscious about what you're doing and who you're adding and why. And I've also been adding more entrepreneurs onto the board and so forth. So it's like you have to really plan out who you need overall. And then when you're looking at that, though, look at, okay, well, we should have some gender diversity on there. We should have some racial diversity. It has to be a conscious thought, or all of a sudden the board of all male old white men is going to recommend another old white man for the position, and everyone's going to say, oh yeah, great background, which she probably has, but it's not the same viewpoint. It's not as diverse a viewpoint, so you're always better off.
But in Lithuania, we have a very interesting statistic that we are #1 in Europe based on women being in the high-tech sectors. So keeping in mind that in Lithuania there are more female than men, of course we need to take some jobs, but there are certain areas where we have this gender gap. And one of them is the area that we work close with. So this is, for example, fintech. And financial industry and economy has been known as a masculine business for ages. And now, as the girls trying to step in, we need to prove our worth, the value being here. And around 40% of the companies still don't have, from 0 to 30% female workers at the company. I'm not talking about female leadership. Of course, we can be happy, okay, 60% still has some female entrepreneurs, leaders, managers, whatever, but then the gap of having diversity in the team, this is something that we need to work with. And maybe we could talk a bit about the reasons, why does it happen? So during the lunch, we had a discussion that the roots usually go down to the education part. For example, when you are in school and you need to find those after-class activities, so the boys usually are encouraged to take the technology classes, the girls usually move to the crafts, drawing, and this is how we are perfect at the soft skills. You know, the girls are super wonderful in multitasking, and what I can see from my team, you know, they can deliver anything within seconds. But then, of course, the hard skills, the programming, the tech background, it comes from the school. So what's your takeaway on that? And, you know, what are the roots of females being maybe less active? Because when we see about the job applications, usually we get less of those when companies announce that they are looking for some managers. Yeah. So this is a saying that the guys will sell themselves with a promise, and the girls really need to bring with a backpack full of experience.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's really about, it changes as we see more women in roles that leadership roles, more women in fintech. I mean, you just need even a few stars that are actually very public and out there, and all of a sudden little girls think, oh, I can do that. It's like, and it's not tech related, but 2 weeks ago I was on an airplane, and the pilot, you know how they always do, the pilot announced, and I was with my husband who had the exact same reaction because it was a female pilot, and it never even struck me before. So the voice was like, this is blah, 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 your pilot, and blah, blah. And I went, and I'm like, oh my goodness, I'm 49 years old, and I've never heard a female pilot on the thing. Like, is that a thing? And his reaction was the same. It's like, it's a woman pilot, and it was a big plane. And that's just something that's so ridiculous. But like, how do you get through 49 years of lots of flying and you've never heard a female voice? Now all of a sudden it's like, yeah, women can be pilots. I mean, it never occurred to me that women couldn't be pilots, but in actuality, never heard it. And now that's like, wow, that should be something that's a thing. Why aren't there more women pilots? And it's just sort of an assumed thing with everything. So it's when you have women going into tech, the more cool startup women are out there and sort of doing more things, and maybe for women as a whole, it's us taking more initiative to kind of like go talk at different things, and because that's something that, and I think it's part of the whole thing where we're still managing home and work at the same time. But when I'm organizing events for Silicon Vikings, a lot of times it's harder to get women to come speak, because I think some of it is, well, I have my kids and they have math homework and I have to do all this stuff, and so and events are in the evenings and they don't have as much time, and so it's always a little bit harder to get that sort of gender diversity on panels and other things. And a lot of times too is it's also sort of a self-fulfilling cycle, because when you get to speak on panels, all the other groups in the area see who's spoken on a panel, and you kind of make your little list of, oh, this speaker would be cool, and you have this like reference list for different topics. And then when you're like, oh, I want to do something on fintech, then you look at your list, and all the prior speakers that you've known of, they're all male, so suddenly your panel is all male, where there probably is, you know, I know there are other women who could be on the panel, you just aren't aware of it. So the more you speak, the more you're in the speaking circles, and the more your name gets out, and the more you get asked. And so I think we all have to sort of put ourselves out there more.
Talking about pilots, I'll just add one more thing. I remember I had a conversation with someone from the university in Lithuania that they are preparing pilots. And they said they had this unwritten quota for the boys and girls being students in that particular pilot program. And of course, girls were way less because they encourage girls to take those administrative roles, like the flights management and similar, but not the pilot itself. So just an interesting parallel that I had an idea with. But yeah, the question here.
Thank you. Thank you for this great presentation. And I just have one more question regarding networking. Well, you mentioned that attending conferences, lectures, events is very important, and of course I agree with that. But there are these informal networks that are nearly always male, for instance, sports, golfing, hunting, all these kind of things. And I think I'm not the only one who has a colleague or someone in our network who has this advantage of having contacts of ministers, vice ministers, stars, TV people who they meet at basketball games, and they just can get work deals done like that. And I would never have the same access. Actually, I tried that once. I asked if I can come to a basketball game, but I gotta know. So, I mean, what would you suggest for women? How do we enter these informal circles? Should we establish, I don't know, book clubs? I don't know. How do we turn this the other way around? And yeah.
I mean, that one is actually probably the most challenging question in this whole issue, and that is a lot of business has always been done outside of business areas. One of the ways we sort of combat that in one way are these women's groups where you're at least meeting other people and women are building up their own networks, so it's not as important. But I mean, the reality is, even when you push your way into it, if they'd let you come to basketball, you would have been like the one wrecking the basketball game where the talk is not what it should be and other things. And so I think part of it is still moving more and more the business sector of technology into business settings, and you have to work around it. I don't think the answer to that is go learn how to play basketball if you don't know how, or try and compete in a male area. I think we can't compete with men in the way that men do things, because I think we lose at that, and I think we have to basically create our own ways of doing the same thing in a different way. And it's not book clubs or whatever, but because I don't think it's finding another sport type of event or something to do. I think it's making ourselves important through the branding and through the women's networks, building up your own personal network in a way that these company kind of off things that are male will eventually not be as important as they are now. I mean, they have been kind of the backbone of business forever, but that doesn't mean it has to stay that way, because it really shouldn't be. So I think we can still excel working around them with the other tools. But you never win by trying to sort of insert yourself in a thing where it's not going to work, 'cause you don't.
Also, I think to add on, not all the best connections hide into those private clubs. For example, our organization, what ROCKIT does, so we run over 150 events about technology, innovation, fintech, personal development, entrepreneurship. And on the same stage, you can meet Marius Šimašius, our mayor of Vilnius, minister of finance, lots of great entrepreneurs, from unicorns to developing stars. And you should reach out to broader community. So you don't have to play basketball if that's not your passion, but if you do, I believe you'll find great connections in your circle. But think of what really matters to you and interests you, because that could be the same-minded people that would be leaded towards the same way. I'm sure you are the program participant of the Women for Global Challenges. Yeah, so this is kind of the niche where you already go and look for the contacts. You have valuable mentors. You push out yourself, out of the comfort zone and look for expertise there. So you're on the right track. And I was just remembering somebody gave a good advice. All the conferences are not for the talks. So it's a nice talk we're gonna go and network, and this is all for the context that you bring afterwards. Because you can listen, same talk, same discussions with different speakers all over the world, but the connections that you make locally in front of yourself, these are the ones that matters. So we have the question here.
Thank you. At the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned that we should talk about diversity because we are not even close to where we should be. It would be interesting to ask if you have an idea of where we should be. What is the ideal situation in terms of gender diversity?
The ideal situation, in my mind, is that there's really no difference. For a female entrepreneur versus a male entrepreneur, you have the same access to networks, you have the same access to funding, and it's just something where gender is irrelevant. I always get a little bit of pushback with that, well, not all women want to be in this field, they do this or that. Some of them want to stay home. And it's like, yeah, that's true, but I'm sure there's an equal proportion of men who want that same kind of thing. So anything that you want as a woman, you should have the same ability to achieve it as a man does. So it's not that there's a specific ratio, although honestly, if you objectively sort of look at it, it really should end up coming on average out to 50-50 throughout the industries, because you should have the same amount, people are all different, and you should have the same amount of people interested in law and finance and other things, and if everything really were equal, I think it would, like if the barriers weren't there and the stereotypes and other things, you would end up roughly 50-50 in the outcome based on the population. If the population's equal, it should end up being about the same.
And how would we know if we are already there?
If a little girl can dream that she wants to be a rocket scientist and there's no barrier for her that's any different than what a man is, that she's encouraged to be a rocket scientist and she gets all the backing she needs for it all the way up. So, and it's the ability really for us ourselves to be able to really look at what do we want, what are we interested in, apart from what people tell us we're supposed to be interested in. And we actually have the ability to completely pursue that. We have the ability to do it where having kids or not having kids has no influence on our decisions, because it doesn't with men. So we should be able to do that without anything being a choice. Like it should just be, this is who I am, this is what I love, I'm gonna go after this.
Any other questions? Questions from the top?
Hi. When we talk about women empowerment, we usually talk about women only. I do see a problem that the men are obliged to act in a certain way as well. Mm-hmm. I can give my personal example. My husband is now going to go on a paternal leave, and he's being treated as a hero. But, I mean, he's a hero to a certain extent, because only 3% of men in Lithuania goes for a paternity leave. So that's, that's nothing compared to what women do. But I read an article that it's not enough for women to be a feminist. We also need men to be a feminist. But we need to encourage them somehow to act in a bit different way that they used than they thought to act. So what are your ideas? How can we encourage them to act and think differently?
I mean, honestly, I think I've raised a boy and a girl, and somehow in my mind, I always picture myself just having girls because I was a feminist, and I just picture, oh, this is how I'm going to raise my girl. And then when I was like, oh, the first one was a boy, I was like, oh my goodness, how do you raise a boy? And I mean, it's the same thing. It's actually letting them cry when they want to cry. It's letting them follow whatever interests they have that are whatever they are. And it is that men are just as much sort of pigeonholed into this is how boys act, this is how girls act, this is what men need to do, and this is what women need to do. All of that is a problem. I agree with you on that. in terms of economic sort of advancement, it's women that are affected by this the most, but on a social level, on a human level, interacting with your kids, all of that, men are definitely sort of at a disadvantage based on stereotypes that are happening. And the standards are different for a mother versus a father and what you're expected to do. What you're saying, I mean, I've always known that throughout the time when my kids were little, and I was like, okay, they're sick all the time when they're little with daycare, so I had to stay home, and my husband called. I was like, okay, I can't miss this meeting, so you need to miss work. And the simple fact of him calling in, I heard the phone call, yeah, I can't come in because my son's sick. And then you heard, yeah, she can't because, you know, she has to, and he'd make up, she has to go to court, because he was like, I didn't go to court, I was a transactional lawyer, but he couldn't say, well, you have a meeting or whatever, because that wasn't legitimate, but somehow he had to make up an excuse where it was like, oh yeah, she really can't stay home, so I'm gonna have to. And he had to explain that all the time, versus it should have been just as easy for him to say, my kid's sick, I need to stay home. There shouldn't have been anything else. And I don't even think it's legal to ask that, but they do still, and it is the assumption, like the man is always the backup parent, he's not the main parent. And women are sort of judged on their parenting, how they're doing. If you're working, you're always questioned about, well, how are your kids are at a disadvantage because they're in daycare, and all that's your fault somehow. It's never like, oh, we've made parenting choices, it's always the woman who has to explain her choices and what she's doing.
But even, especially in the business setting, say when you are hiring or have you're now in the business, even let's say we now have our team of 5 females, but probably at a certain point we're going to need more people. So how, I mean, we also need to bring men on board. So
Yeah.
I do understand the huge part is coming from personal life, but then in a business setting, I think that's very much correlates with what was asked before from the front room. So how to change the behavior of the men in business?
Well, it's the same thing with, like, I don't think that, diversity is diversity. So in your case, unless there's some specific reason you're really holding it to all women, diversity helps in any context. So yeah, you should have a man on there. You should have people of color on there. If they're all white people, you should have some international people in there. It should all be part of the diversity mix. So it's not, the more of that you get to, the better off your company is the point. I don't know if that answered the question, but or if I...
No, I mean, we turn the discussion into more of the personal life. They understand that in the business setting, men are expected to hire men, or they are expected to go to basketball game to watch it. It's not that they probably want to invite women, but they're just unwritten rules that they're not allowed. Even though some of them want that. So how do we encourage them to break the circle? I mean, we know that there are less women for us, but also there are certain limits for men, how they're supposed to act. So we need to help them to...
Yeah, I mean, I think it starts with that. It starts with parenting, it starts with schools, it starts with, I mean, like my daughter, she's a teacher now, and she teaches elementary school in 4th grade. And one of the things, and I hadn't even thought of this before she started teaching, but she's very aware of everything socially and has advanced my feminism like 10 times. But one of the things she says is, it bothers me so much that teachers say, okay, boys and girls, and boys line up here and girls line up here. And I mean, something as simple as that is actually setting up this division between who's doing what. And so, and I was like, oh, well, what would you say? And she was like, you'd say, okay, students. You know, I mean, it's so simple, just changing the terms, because it starts when they're little, too. And if we change the vocabulary, and all of a sudden, it's okay for the boys to use the glitter and the other things, it changes the overall mentality. And I think the more we break down gender stereotypes overall, the better it is for everyone. So these kind of discussions, even about women's stereotypes, they apply to men too. It's just not they don't have the sort of impact on negative impact on earnings and career progression the way we do. But yeah, encouraging that if you want to be a nurse, go be a nurse. If you want to be a teacher, that's another area where we don't see a lot of men in elementary schools and on. And that's an important thing. So it really is about letting each person be their own individual self and what they think, sort of what they really want to do.
And also to add, I believe sometimes pure female companies or pure male companies, they are creating products for everyone. So at this time, you meet the client crisis. So what the other part of the audience is thinking about your product and how they experience it. And from my perspective and the stereotypes, what the guys should think, we were creating the event for mixed audience. And we have more male audience here in our community. And we had a ballet dancer together with us making the program. And I said, yeah, but can we, like he offered, can we have like maybe some ballet dancers, some very classical performance? And I came up with this very stereotypical statement. Can we make something more male-ish, more entertaining? And I got this weird look. What do you mean? You want to say that classic performances in ballet is not interesting to the guys, and this is what they do full time. So I got this, fish slap to my face, and I never gonna say that again. And it was really thinking, like having opposite minds and never say that, basketball is for all boys. So something that we really need to work on. But I have a question for the boys in the room, because usually when the topic circles around diversity, like the tension in the air raised a little bit. So how many of you feel uncomfortable talking about this topic? And, do you feel weird, or is something natural? So could you raise your hand if it's a bit odd or something? Very shy hands. Some slight pressure? Okay. The minority, so very good sign. So I believe let's wrap up. We promised to have some networking, right? So let's move to this part. Thank you very much again for sharing your insights. And this is the CEO of Silicon Vikings. Use your chance to exchange contacts and stand out in front of your colleagues that you met someone new today and an exciting speaker. Thank you very much.
Thank you.